Don't want to bring the mood down, but we kicked off this afternoon by reflecting on events in New Zealand on Friday. We spoke about it briefly with Dawn Butler, also with Jenny Trent-Hughes, who's still with us. Right now, I want to look at Islamophobia generally. Again, I mentioned this before, that if you look at the timeline on the feed for this very radio station, a lot of people seem to think use the word Islamophobia, and it's designed to restrict free speech, to stop people commenting about things like radical Islam or Sharia law. And yet my interpretation of Islamophobia is very, very different. And I make no apology for this. I nicked this from The Guardian. I think it was published, 2 years ago, 2017. And in it's a number of articles that were published in the end of 2016. Islamist school can segregate boys and girls in the Times. Our Daily Express website, 9 days later, anger as less than a third of Muslim nations sign up to coalition against ISIS. The Sun online, 1st of December, secret is safe. Half of British Muslims would not go to COPs if they knew someone with ISIS links. The Daily Express the day after, new £5 notes could be banned by religious groups as bank can't promise they're halal. ITV News the same day, half of UK Muslims would not report extremism. 2 days later in the Sunday Times, enclaves of Islam see UK as 75% Muslim. The Mail on Sunday the same day, isolated British Muslims are so cut off from the rest of society that they see the UK as 75% Islamic, shock report reveals. Every one of those stories, totally untrue. Every one of those stories, the newspapers had to publish corrections for. Research, one of the reasons I suppose we might ask ourselves is a study in 2007 found that 91% of articles about Muslims and Islam published in a single week were negative. A 2011 study by the University of Leeds looked at 4 newspapers over 3 months and put the figure at 70%. And I'm wondering if part of the problem is a lack of Muslim journalists. Fewer than 0.5% of UK journalists are Muslim compared to a population level of around 5%. Here to share his thoughts, a senior researcher at Hope Not Hate, is Joe Mulhall. Good afternoon to you, Joe.
Afternoon.
The word Islamophobia, you'd have thought it was a banner under which people could unite to understand the spread of hate. And yet I'm seeing it used on Twitter as a word that's being bandied around, meaning restrictions of free speech.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? But in reality, I don't think we can necessarily always take Twitter as just the yardstick of what a word means, what society believes. Yes. The truth of the matter is that most people understand Islamophobia to mean the hatred or the being anti-Muslim in some form. And the word has increasingly become to be accepted by both scholars and campaigners. Although there's some debates around its definition, I think most people generally have a consensus around it. There are, as you say, a small number of people, often who have been kind of reproached themselves for engaging in things that others have deemed Islamophobic, who have then turned around and said, you're just shutting me down. But I don't think that necessarily stands up on closer inspection ordinarily.
Where are you in... What do you believe about what is said and then what happens? Is there... I think it's noticeable. This is an entirely subjective opinion, but I think it's tangible, noticeable that there has been a rise of the far right in the UK. I think racism, to my view, to my mind, in my life, I see signs of it on the rise. I looked at some graffiti today, which I can't repeat over the airwaves. Absolutely horrible. And then you had terrible events in New Zealand. Can we link the two, or is that a dangerous game to go down?
No, I think if you're looking at the rise of the far right, I think you're right. I think we've seen some really, really worrying trends across the whole of Europe. But in the UK last year, we saw some of the biggest far-right demonstrations probably since the 1930s, certainly since the 1970s, some of which had 10,000 people on. These are really worrying signs. And in terms of linking the two, it's not simple. You can't just draw a direct line necessarily and say it's like a conveyor belt. But what is true is that if you have a narrative advanced by far-right groups like people like Tommy Robinson or Stephen Lennon in the UK that constantly tell people that Muslims and Islam are incompatible with the West and that they are a threat and a danger, that sort of narratives and rhetoric does result in some people engaging in violence. It's not simple to say it's a conveyor belt, but there is an ecosystem of prejudice, an ecosystem of hatred, of which is all these various different aspects. And so even some of the people that say they're non-violent and they don't believe in violence, if you push these narratives that other Muslims and make people think that they're not like them and that they're a danger and a threat to British society, some people turn around and engage in violence to try and stop that.
I have a question. Why is it that as people, we always seem to need a bogeyman because I'm of an age. I lived in America for a long time. I've lived here for a long time, and there's always a group of people who are being held up in the public eye as people we should hate. And sometimes I wonder if it's a distraction, to keep us from thinking of what's really going on that we need to be doing something about. Why is it that we always feel we need to hate a group of people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think probably the best answer to that is often why people are angry or upset or we're in a society that they're not happy with. The answers to the causes of those things are really complex. It could be economic, it could be cultural, but a really simple answer is often propagated by people on the far right, for example, is it's Muslims or it's Jews or it's an other group. They offer really simple answers to really complex questions. So why haven't you got a job? Why have you not got enough housing? Why are you struggling for school places? The easy answer is, well, it's Muslims or it's immigrants or it's this other group that have come in and taken it. And those answers are really easy answers to really difficult questions. And as a result, they take hold. And I think we've seen that throughout the 20th century as well.
Kevin's dying to get in here. One of the areas that I think needs to be explored is there does seem to be, certainly it's been reported as such, that the sense that people feel that their legitimate concerns weren't being listened to. And I think if you look at something like the Rotherham child abuse, which we're going to be talking about, Rochdale child abuse, we're going to be talking about with Maggie Oliver, one of the former DCI who was involved in Rochdale. You could get the sense there that the politicians, the police were frightened to say anything because they were aware that most of the culprits, well, I think all of the culprits were of Pakistani origin and Muslims. So you have people afraid to say things, and that in turn, I presume, leads to a pressure building up that then manifests itself in anger, rage, or worse.
Look, I mean, look, when we talk about those kind of on-street grooming cases and those court cases, they're absolutely horrifying, and quite clearly huge amounts of things went wrong to ever let it get that far. And perhaps some of the drivers that you've mentioned are at the core of it. But generally speaking, actually, if you think about these discussions around things like Muslims, things like Islam and immigration and all these things, these happen in the newspapers every single day. The question is how suppressed these positions actually are. As I said, we had demonstrations talking about grooming gangs in London last year that had over 10,000 people on them on a stage outside Westminster through a microphone on a huge screen. So how suppressed really is this? These people are talking about these issues every day on social media, on YouTube. They're pushing out their views and discussions around this stuff. So the question is whether or not how true it is that they're being shut down and they're not being allowed to do it. They're on every news channel in the country.
Great point. Kevin.
Joe, there's no doubt that there are people in the media and certainly politicians who seek to demonise Muslims. Now, if you track what Donald Trump says about them, for example. No. Every single time he mentions Islam, he doesn't talk about Islam, he talks about radical Islam. So I'm wondering, this is a very difficult question, but what can we do about this language that specifically sets out to demonise a whole group of people?
Well, I suppose radical Islam, he might argue, is a fair target. Radical Islam is ISIS, is Daesh.
Trust me, Donald Trump never says Islam. He always says radical
But then
Islam.
He's being specific. And the worst thing about Islamophobia is when people conflate nutters with bombs and guns with law-abiding, decent taxpayers. That's the confusion. So Donald Trump's quite crafty, isn't he, Joe?
That's my point.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, the part of the thing here is there's often a wink and a nod to people when he's talking about Muslims. I'd actually say quite a lot of his rhetoric goes well beyond just talking about radical Islam, with things like the Muslim ban, for example, which was a pretty blanket policy. But I agree, this is part of the thing, is lots of people are often very, very clever in their language, and they work on the basis that people know what they mean. And I think we've seen that in the UK, often with people like Tommy Robinson, who for years wasn't banned by Facebook, for example, because he didn't necessarily overstep that line. He knew where it was, and he stayed on the right side of it.
Last thought, Joe, should we be looking once again at Boris Johnson? I mean, he wrote in The Spectator in 2005 that problem is Islam, Islam is the problem.
Yes, I mean, look, we, Hope Not Hate have done a large amount of polling around the issues of Islamophobia, and there is a real problem inside the Conservative Party with its membership, but also, as you say, people like Boris Johnson who've said really appalling things, and there is a problem in the grassroots of the Conservative Party, and that reflects a problem in wider society in terms of attitudes towards Muslims, But if you ask, for example, Conservative voters, do they think Islam is incompatible with the British way of life? 49% say yes, it is. So there's clearly a problem within the Conservative Party, and people like Boris Johnson have fed that problem and tried to kind of gain for themselves off the back of it. And it's really, really ugly and worrying politics.
Joe Mulhall, I'll have to leave it there. I just note that in the 30, 40 years of coverage of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, I don't remember anyone referring to Christian extremists, but maybe I missed it. Thank you very much, Joe Mulhall, Senior Researcher at Hope Not Hate. Jenny Trent-Hughes, the last thought on that for now.
I think that what we need to have is more open dialogue. And I don't think it's about shutting these people up. I think it's about the likes of the three of us in here opening up more. That's the problem, is the people with the bad thoughts are ready to shout from the rooftops what they think, and we don't.
So the decent people need to be louder.
Exactly. That's my thought.
Okay.